Your engine is being fed a chemical cocktail. It was never designed to drink. This is the truth about the G100UL solvent trap and why your engine valves are about to fail. For 80 years, 100LL was the blue blood that kept our air-cooled tractors alive. It was not just fuel, it was a lubricant and a cooling agent for your most expensive parts. But now, a new unleaded replacement is being forced into the tanks of every Cessna and Piper in America. They say it is a drop-in solution, but there is a hidden mechanical shadow lurking in the chemistry. We are seeing a massive surge in reports of pitted valve stems and dissolved seals that regulators are not talking about yet. This is not just a fuel swap, it is a high-stakes experiment, and your engine is the lab rat. Is the push for clean air creating a mortal failure for your legacy iron? And are you being led into a financial trap that will ground your airplane forever? A mechanic stands in the shadow of a hangar, holding up a glass vial of blue 100LL. This is not just fuel, it is the lifeblood that kept generations of Lycoming and Continental engines running when everything else failed. In the 1950s, when Cessna and Piper stamped out their first air-cooled workhorses, nobody trusted the metallurgy alone to survive the violence inside a cylinder. They built these engines heavy, with thick valve stems, broad 45-degree exhaust faces, and soft cast iron seats. But even that was not enough. The real secret weapon was tetraethyllead. Every time a piston fired, tetraethyllead burned into lead oxide, spreading a microscopic film across the hottest surfaces. That film did not just fight detonation. It formed a cushion, an invisible pad, between the exhaust valve and its seat, soaking up the hammer blows of combustion at 700, 800, even 900 degrees Celsius. Without it, the raw steel and iron would grind against each other, the valve face pitting and welding with every cycle. With it, the metal surfaces slid apart on a layer of lead, so slick, friction dropped from 0.3 to less than 0.1. Old service manuals from Lycoming and Continental spelled it out. Run unleaded, and you would see the seats recede, the valves burn, and the overhaul clock speed up. With lead, a 2,000-hour TBO was possible. Without it, you were lucky to see 1,000. Field tests in the 1950s measured recession rates at less than 1,000th of an inch per 100 hours on tetraethyl lead, 10 times better than unleaded. The lead film absorbed the stress, protected the soft seats, and prevented the micro-welding that destroys a valve face. This was not an accident. The engineers of the era knew exactly what they were doing. They designed for a world where lead was always present, where the blue streak of 100LL was as much a mechanical buffer as it was a fuel. They accepted the trade-off, a little lead fouling on the plugs, some gray dust in the oil, in exchange for mechanical survival. The alternative was catastrophic. Valve faces pitted, seats hammered into oblivion, and engines grounded long before their time. In that world, lead was the insurance policy. It was the difference between a machine that could shrug off abuse and one that would surrender to the relentless pounding of combustion. The overbuilt geometry, thick seats, wide contact bands, generous clearances, paired with tetraethyl lead chemistry, gave these engines a margin for error that modern designs can only envy. Physics did not care about regulations or health warnings. It cared about contact pressure, heat, and the brutal arithmetic of wear. For decades, the blue miracle kept the legacy iron alive. Now, with that cushion dissolving into memory, the mechanical baseline is about to be shattered. A glass jar sits on the workbench, holding 3 O-rings. Left, 100LL, barely swollen. Middle, a 50-50 blend, noticeably plumper. Right, pure G100UL, bloated, soft, stretched to the point of uselessness. Every mechanic knows what comes next. Fuel selectors that seize, leaks that creep, and the slow, silent sabotage of legacy hardware. The culprit is not lead, but something new. A chemical profile born from environmental mandates, not mechanical mercy. G100UL does not just swap out one molecule for another, it drags a solvent shadow behind it, a blend of aromatics and metatoluidine that acts less like a fuel and more like mechanical paint thinner. In the old world, 100LL's toluene kept seals pliable but mostly intact. G100UL, with its aggressive aromatic backbone, takes Buna N and nitrile, those black rubber rings pressed into service since Eisenhower was president, and swells them by 63%. Not a typo. 63, compared to 4% in 100UL. That is not just a number, that is a control cable refusing to move, a selector valve stuck mid-flight, a fuel leak pooling under the wing. Cessna and Piper never imagined their engines would swim in this new solvent bath. They wrote their manuals for a world where rubber meant resilience, not risk. Metatoluidine, the high-octane darling of G100UL, is the chemical equivalent of a crowbar. It pries apart the molecular structure of legacy elastomers, turning what used to be a tight, reliable seal into a gummy, swollen liability. Mechanics in California, the first to see G100UL on the ramp, started pulling out O-rings that looked like they had been soaking in turpentine. Some dissolved into black sludge, clogging filters and binding selectors. The phrase started making rounds in the hangar, the solvent shadow. Not just a change in fuel, but a creeping threat that seeps into every gasket, every seam, every overlooked detail in a 60-year-old airframe. This is not theoretical. The numbers are stamped in the lab logs and written in the service reports. In one test, a 20-year-old Buna N O-ring, after a week in G100UL, ballooned to nearly double its original diameter. The same ring in 100LL barely changed. The difference between 4% and 63 is not a footnote. It is the line between reliable function and catastrophic outcome. FAA certification does not erase physics. STC paperwork cannot negotiate with chemistry. When the solvent shadow falls, it does not care about regulatory optimism. It attacks the weakest link, and in these engines, that link is everywhere rubber meets fuel. G100UL's defenders point to cleaner plugs and longer oil intervals. But the price of that cleanliness is paid in silent, incremental failures. Seals that swell, bladders that seep, selectors that grind and stick. The promise of a drop-in replacement evaporates the first time a mechanic drags out a dissolved O-ring, black and shapeless, from a fuel selector that once spun like silk. This is the mechanical cost of unleaded progress, a solvent shadow stretching from the tank all the way to the valves. The blue miracle is gone. What is left is a chemistry experiment running loose in a fleet built for a different era. A mechanic's finger traces the outline of a valve face, pausing at the dull, cratered edge. It is not erosion from years of honest work. This is the signature of micro-welding, adhesive wear, the kind that starts invisible and ends in terminal failure. The theory is not new. In the 1950s, Bowden and Tabor spelled it out: when two metals meet under brutal heat, 650, 750, 850 degrees Celsius, their surface peaks, the tiny asperities, begin to soften. Without a lubricant, those peaks do not just slide, they fuse. For a split second, steel and iron weld together at the atomic level. Then, as the valve lifts, those bonds rip apart, tearing out microscopic chunks. What is left behind are pits, scars, and the slow spiral toward catastrophic outcome. In the old world, lead's oxide layer acted as a sacrificial film. It sheared before the steel ever could, keeping friction low and stopping those micro-welds in their tracks. The numbers are clinical. With lead, the friction coefficient drops to less than 0.1. Without it, it jumps to 0.3 or higher. That is not just a statistic. That is the difference between a valve that seats for 2,000 hours and one that burns up before 1,000. The lead did not just cushion impact, it interrupted the very physics of adhesion, soaking up the violence of every power stroke. Now, with G100UL and its solvent shadow, the lead film is gone. The exhaust valve and seat face each other raw, exposed at every cycle to temperatures that would melt most metals. The so-called mechanical paint thinner does not offer any protection. It strips away the old deposits, leaving only bare steel and iron to fend for themselves. Every time the engine fires, those surfaces are hammered together at hundreds of pounds per square inch. At 700, 800, even 900 degrees Celsius, the metal softens just enough for the peaks to weld, then shear, then pit. The result is a contact band that goes from mirror smooth to cratered in less than a season. This is not a matter of opinion. Lycoming's own manuals warned of it. Continental's service instructions from the 1950s list unleaded operation as a recipe for seat recession and mortal damage. The lead film did not just help, it was the only thing standing between legacy iron and aviation extinction. Without it, the overbuilt geometry of those old engines, thick seats, wide faces, generous clearances, becomes a liability. Physics does not care about environmental optimism, it cares about heat, pressure, and the brutal arithmetic of wear. In the absence of lead, every valve is now a test specimen, every flight a wager against the finality of the engine. A bench test cylinder sits open, its exhaust valve face pocked with craters that run from the margin to the center. Under magnification, the story is clinical. Pits start small, 10 microns across, barely visible to the naked eye. But cycle after cycle, those pits grow, connecting, deepening, gouging the contact band until the seat itself is chewed away. The surface that once gleamed like polished chrome now looks like the moon, scarred, uneven, and doomed. This is not slow erosion, it is the mechanical signature of micro-welding in action. Every time the valve slams shut at 800 degrees Celsius, the peaks on the steel fuse to the seat, then shear off, tearing out metal grain by grain. Without the lead film, there is nothing to interrupt this violence. The so-called mechanical paint thinner, G100UL, strips away old deposits, leaving bare metal to face the full brunt of combustion. Lab logs from the 1950s and recent field reports agree. Pitting starts at 10 microns, but in a matter of months, that can double, triple, until 50-micron craters merge and the contact area collapses. When that happens, the seat loses its shape, the seal goes soft, and hot gases start to leak past every time the piston rises. The recession accelerates, the valve face thins, and the margin that once measured a healthy 60 thousandths is hammered down to 20, then 10, then nothing. Mechanics call it recession, but it is really the slow march toward terminal failure. On the bench, a mechanic holds up a shattered valve face, the edge missing in chunks. The invoice next to it lists not just a top overhaul, but a new seat, a new guide, and sometimes a new cylinder. The numbers do not lie. Unleaded operation can drive recession rates from 1/1000th of an inch per 100 hours, what you would see with TEL, to 10 times that figure. At that pace, a valve that once survived 2,000 hours is lucky to see 400 before catastrophic outcome. The higher BTU output of G100UL only adds to the heat load, making every cycle a little harsher, every margin a little thinner. There is no mystery here. The progression is inevitable unless something interrupts it. The seat goes from polished to cratered, the margin from thick to razor thin, and the engine from reliable to a gamble. Bench test data, field teardowns, and parts invoices all point to the same conclusion. Without mitigation, the solvent shadow does not just haunt the rubber and paint. It carves its way straight to the heart of the engine, one pit at a time, until the only thing left between flight and grounding is the luck of the metallurgy. A stack of FAA paperwork sits on the bench, thick with signatures and stamps, but thin on substance where it matters. The G100UL approval package, hundreds of pages deep, reads like a checklist for regulatory compliance, not mechanical survival. Nowhere in the STC documentation does it spell out the most basic questions. How does this mechanical paint thinner behave after 6 months soaking into 50-year-old Buna N? What happens when a legacy valve seat faces 500 hours of unleaded combustion, cycle after cycle, without the sacrificial lead film? The DRS listing for G100UL, buried in the FAA's database, acknowledges the fuel's composition and octane rating. But search for soak tests, elastomer compatibility clauses, or any mention of ASTM D4701 or D909 protocols. Nothing. No requirement for long-term immersion of O-rings at operating temperatures. No scanning electron micrographs of valve faces after simulated service. Not a single endurance cycle spelled out for the hardware that keeps legacy engines running. The paperwork is silent on micro-welding, on the adhesive wear that turns a polished valve seat into a cratered wasteland. It's silent on the swelling and softening of rubbers that were never designed for aromatic solvents. The only reference to material compatibility is a generic nod to approved components, as if the chemistry of the 1950s and the volatility of modern aromatics are interchangeable. No service difficulty reports are required. No post-market surveillance for swelling, leaking, or catastrophic outcome. The STC is a green light, nothing more. A pass on the regulatory gauntlet, not a guarantee of mechanical resilience. The FAA's own regulatory system demands proof against detonation and vapor lock, but not against the slow sabotage of legacy parts. There's no ASTM spec for G100UL, no requirement for third-party lab validation, no clause demanding that a mechanic's teardown after 500 hours reveals anything but scorched earth. The burden shifts from the certifiers to the owners. When a fuel selector binds or a valve seat recedes, the paperwork offers no recourse. It's a paper shield against physics, and physics is merciless. The solvent shadow falls, and the only defense left is the vigilance of those who keep these engines alive, one inspection at a time. A mechanic slides a new O-ring across the bench, the label on the bag reading Viton FKM. This is not nostalgia, it is survival. The old Buna N seals, once good enough for a world of blue G100UL, are now a liability in the age of mechanical paint thinner. Viton, a fluoroelastomer, shrugs off the solvent shadow that swells and dissolves legacy rubber. The chemistry is simple. Aromatic amines can't pry apart the carbon-fluorine backbone. Where Buna N balloons 60% in G100UL, Viton barely budges. It is not cheap, and it is not original, but it is the only thing standing between a dry fuel system and the creeping sabotage of black sludge. Every owner with a wrench and a conscience is drawing up their own checklist. Step 1. Purge every Buna N O-ring, gasket, and seal from the fuel path. Do not wait for a leak to stain the hangar floor or a selector to freeze mid-flight. The part numbers are out there. MS29513 for Viton, color-coded brown instead of black. Step 2. Overhaul the inspection rhythm. The old 1,200-hour top-end schedule is a luxury of the leaded era. In the solvent shadow, every 800 hours is a new line on the calendar. Lap the valves, bore scope the seats, measure the margin. If the contact band shows pitting or the margin thins past 40 thousandths, pull the cylinder. Physics does not care about FAA paperwork or environmental optimism. It cares about contact pressure, heat, and time. Step 3. Demand real data. Owners are organizing pooled fuel samples, sending vials of G100UL to independent labs for soak tests and GCMS analysis. They want answers on swelling rates, valve recession, and micro-welding, not just regulatory sign-offs. Until the FAA publishes ASTM D471 and D909 results, the burden lands on the people who keep these engines alive. No one is waiting for a manufacturer's recall. Every mechanic is now a frontline investigator. This is the new normal. Swap to Viton, cut the overhaul interval, test everything, trust nothing. The only defense left is vigilance, a torque wrench, and a refusal to let fragile chemistry dictate the finality of the engine. The solvent shadow falls, but it does not have to win. Today, every legacy engine faces the solvent shadow, mechanical paint thinner in the tanks, micro-welding at the valve face, and fragile chemistry erasing decades of overbuilt reliability. Physics doesn't care about regulatory optimism or green mandates. Only hard metal, scarred hands, and vigilance stand between us and a catastrophic outcome. The finality of the engine isn't theoretical, it's waiting in every logbook. Drop your perspective below. This fight isn't over.